Welcome once again to Crossroads TV, the online component of China Crossroads, the in-person event in Shanghai. Today we're talking about ABCs, American-born Chinese, also known as Chinese Americans, as we like to say in America. A subtle difference we'll talk about. Very happy to be welcoming today George Hu, who is head of counseling at Duke Kunshan University and a clinical psychologist, and former head of mental health at Shanghai United Family Hospitals. Also happy to have Aric Shang, who is the co-host of the Honest Drink podcast, which has over 140,000 subscribers abroad and in China. So let's kick off the questions today with George. And you've recently been working on a piece called Never White Enough. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, I think this piece really started off as a memoir, I guess, of sorts, right, of my own experience growing up in the States as an ABC, but then also juxtaposed with my experience coming here to mainland China. We came to mainland China almost really 11 years ago or so now. And coming to China as a Chinese American, right? So somebody who perhaps ethnically and racially looks like, you know, I fit in, but culturally doesn't, right? And sort of the piece is really focused on the experience of feeling like an outsider in both places, right? And feeling a little bit homeless, you know, of sorts. You know, and I don't want to, you know, push too fine a point on it. I love being an American, and I'm really proud of my country and the opportunities that it has offered myself and my family, you know, because of just the history of our families getting there, which I think many of us have similar histories. And so I'm really, really grateful. But it is a fact that, you know, in any culture where there's an ethnic majority and ethnic minorities, you know, there are sometimes, you know, otherization that can occur, feeling that the core or the real stuff is happening somewhere else that you're not, you know? And that experience was mirrored a little bit coming here, right? Coming here not in an unprivileged state, right? Coming here in a privileged state, but also feeling like, yes, you have privilege, but there's also this world that doesn't accept you, right? And that views you as somehow other, maybe not completely other, but there's parts of it that are otherized. Yeah.
Well, let's get into that a little more. I mean, did you feel a sense of dislocation or disorientation in America as a Chinese American, and did that partly, you know, influence your coming to China? And you know, one would expect you to feel like you'd belong here, but then you also felt a sense of disorientation here. So couldn't you explain that?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is no. It was not that feeling that drove me to come to China. It was really more of a professional growth and being part of a field, and you know, I'm in the mental health field, so being part of a field that's in a different stage. So I would say no, but you're right in that, yes, coming here, I think, you know, there was a feeling, and perhaps as a lot of this has to do with the fact that as an ABC, I grew up speaking a lot more Chinese than my ABC peers. So it's if I speak Chinese, sometimes people can mistakenly assume, right, that I'm part of the culture when I'm not. And also I think there's barriers, right? There's barriers of to professional growth here as a non-Chinese person. There's barriers to functioning in society as a non-Chinese person, even though linguistically I can function, that, you know, would not be present for a Chinese person. And so, yeah, I have felt those.
Sure.
Yeah.
Aric, what's been your experience as a Chinese American, both in the U.S. and also coming here? How have you felt being here?
You know, I think one element is it's hard for me to detach my experience from the period in my life.
Yeah.
And so I spent, obviously, my youth and young adulthood in the U.S., and those were formative years. And so you're navigating a lot of things, including your ethnicity, including trying to find belonging in your career. And then when I moved here, I was quite young. And then another piece of my life, adulthood, I spent a lot of it out here discovering myself as well. So it's hard for me to detach but coming out here was a great opportunity, and I still maintain connection back home, and I travel back home.
When you say opportunity, you mean professional opportunity?
Professional, meeting people, growing, and just finding myself. So it's hard for me to sort of disassociate that. But I've been able to maintain all those links, and on all these years, I've been fortunate to work for all U.S. companies as well, and maintaining that link back. But certainly, China's given lots of opportunity, right? And when you come out here, the community itself, then there's an expat community, and you're obviously mingling, with people from China as well. And so I think it was just so fascinating, and there was the curiosity, and so I didn't have to think as much about my identity because it was actually embraced.
Right.
Your identity as what was embraced?
As a Chinese American.
How did you? Could I ask a question? I'm sorry. Like, how did you feel the embracing?
Well, I think that the U.S. has a certain level of stature in the world. I mean, at least until recently.
Yeah.
And so I always felt very proud. And whether I traveled to Argentina or to different parts of the world, I felt that people were curious about me.
Yeah.
On the other hand, my ancestors come from, here in Taiwan.
Yeah.
And so I think people were very curious. So people from China were always curious, like, what was it like? Because they felt, they saw the similarity, and they also saw some of the distinctiveness.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, being a Chinese American is very helpful, or a Chinese overseas from a successful, wealthy country. Of course, if you're from a poor country, may not be as advantageous.
Yeah.
So I've definitely felt that myself, that especially in the past, I mean, being America has its credibility, and it's still seen as a place we want to understand here in China, and so we can explain that.
Yeah.
But what about some of the disadvantages? I have my opinions, but are there also disadvantages to being a Chinese American here in Shanghai? Well, I felt personally that we're held to a higher standard of Chinese fluency, also higher standard of cultural fluency. And we're called bananas for a reason, right? So we're not completely yellow on the inside, and so people have that expectation that you're actually Chinese, and we're not fully in a certain sense. Then people can have a disconnect, and that can affect career as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that there is often an assumption, right, that we understand how things work when we really don't.
Yeah.
I also think that it's interesting because you mentioned the expatriate community, and I have no community is monolithic, but I have had an experiences where sometimes the expatriate community doesn't quite consider you foreign.
Right. Exactly.
Even though I was born in the U.S. and carry an American like I'm as American as they come. I think.
Right.
But I'm just multilingual, right? Or my skin is maybe not white, basically, right? But I think that there's that that's a little bit of a microcosm of what happened back home that still happens here.
Right.
And then there's also obviously what we've been talking about from the home culture, right? From the Chinese culture. An assumption that what's happening, but you don't, and so they don't quite explain things because they assume that and that can create misunderstandings and miscommunications and at work and outside the community.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this gets back to terminology. I mean, we're known as American-born Chinese, or others are known as German or French-born Chinese. And Chinese is the noun there, whereas in America, American is the noun, and we're Chinese Americans. And I do feel that, especially from non-Americans in Shanghai, that they assume that I was born and raised here, especially if they're not fluent in English. And it does change expectations of you, and there's often a disconnect. And when I say I'm American, and then they kind of change their attitude, and you feel a bit of that American power actually, and also the power in the English language. When that happens.
How do you think that attitude shifts, do you think? Because I find myself wondering whether it's American power or whether it's a suspicion sometimes.
It could be embarrassment too, because I think if you're a progressive Western European, you're supposed to know these things, and then not have understood that you're an ethnic minority from the United States is perhaps embarrassing to them too.
I see.
Yeah. Well, there's power and then there's influence.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of influence culturally because people around the world have grown up to American culture.
Right.
Disneyland, Mickey Mouse, and that kind of stuff. And so I think that builds, connection. I also think that they're just there's always different ways to look at what tribe you're part of, you know. And I think relating to your earlier example, you know, coming out here, like what tribe are you actually part of, right? And there's commonalities between different tribes. And I think, you know, I've experienced work environments where maybe most of the people in that work environment were, you know, from here, and then from that perspective it was harder to integrate, to understand, because I would be the outsider. So certainly experienced that. But it's not necessarily like a China-US thing. It's just anytime you go from one place to another, there's going to be some detachment or disconnection.
Yeah. I think that there's been a shift for me in terms of the way that I've experienced being a Chinese American here in China, or an ABC here in China. I think that in the early years, I would say maybe the first 5-ish years or so, I did feel a little bit more of this not belonging to either group and feeling like an outsider everywhere. And maybe that was due to just me not being, acclimated to the environment. I'm not sure the reason, but I think that after about 5 years or so, I started to step more into a bridge identity, right? Or an identity where I felt like I had a role in helping both sides, if you will, or both parties or tribes, I guess you put it, sort of understand each other. And I don't hate that, because I feel like, geopolitically, right, that's also important too. Right.
Well, one angle here is that, some of this is this expectation that the world should work for me, right? I come in a place, people should accept me. And I think I totally get what you're saying is that, well, first of all, we spent a lot of time in China, so we developed more empathy, more interpersonal skills, and your role as a bridge, bringing people together, understanding them. And so I feel like if you have really great interpersonal cultural skills, you can go anywhere in the world and get a lot further than someone who's expecting people to follow your paradigm.
Regardless of racial identity.
And we've spent, some big portion of our adult, kind of life and career here, and you working in mental health. I think you probably have much higher levels of empathy than the average person. And
depends on the day.
Depends on the day, right? Yeah, your kids probably hate you. Just
exactly.
Kidding. But I think so. It's hard to decouple a lot of these things. But I do think that we shouldn't always have the expectation that we should always belong. It's kind of needy.
Right.
That's very interesting. Like so you feel like what you're saying is that we shouldn't have this expectation, like you said, expectation of always belonging anywhere.
Or expecting others to accept us.
What about back in your home country?
Yeah.
Like, do we have a right to expect, or maybe expect's the wrong word, but hope for a sense of belonging there?
To some extent, yes.
Yeah.
Right, but
To a greater extent.
Or maybe a greater extent. But where do you draw the? Well, where do you draw the line? And I'll give you an extreme example.
Here too, but.
I'll give you an extreme example. You would not be able to just walk into anyone's house in America if you didn't know them. So that acceptance, there is a limit to that, right? Like you can't just walk into someone's house.
Right.
But if you are at work, and you're, talking
in
to
broader
people
society.
in broader society, what level of civility and politeness and openness.
And the social structures that are in broader society, so not like individual homes on a personal level, but the social structures that are in place, do we have an expectation to feel, do we have the right to feel like a sense of belonging?
Yeah.
We should expect that the country of our birth and citizenship should accept us, and we feel that sense of belonging, especially in the public sphere. And so I think that's reasonable. But what's interesting is in China, I think we also get that, and perhaps it's a bit unearned, but I think in general, Chinese also accept us as part of the Chinese family or tradition. So in some ways,
5,000 years of,
So are you speaking sort of structurally, socially, or are you speaking culturally?
I just mean that people think that we're Chinese, and they talk to us that
Yeah.
way. Well, we're calling this episode The Reality of ABC Anxiety. And so a good question is there really anxiety, status anxiety among Chinese Americans in America? That's one question. Maybe a more direct question is, do you think America has been racist toward Asian Americans?
On a whole, America has definitely been racist toward Asian Americans, right? Like, I mean, there have been laws enacted to exclude people based on race. So definitely, the answer to that question, I think, has America ever been racist to Asians? I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
is America trying to always improve? Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
right. So obviously things nowadays are not the same, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Is it perfect? I mean, I think the legal, when we get to legislative, I don't know that I'm aware of anything legislative that is racist.
Sure.
Like the example that I just said.
Say the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah, yeah. So that was on, on the books. I'm not
right.
aware right now of anything on the books that is racist for us. But I'm also aware that people use, I'm a psychologist, right? People use things to their advantage, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that on a societal level, us as Asian Americans have been used as a pawn a little bit in America's racial conversation, right? And I have not enjoyed that, right? The whole, I mean, obviously people have written a whole lot on the model minority myth and the way that that has really continued to otherize us.
We can integrate, so why can't you? That's the whole
Yeah,
idea,
basically
right?
you're saying, well, you're sort of minimizing us in our experience by saying, oh, you guys have been totally accepted.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm like, well, have we? I don't know that I feel that totally.
Right.
Right? But now you say that because you want somebody else to act some way that you want them to act.
Yeah.
At the same way, assuming that I'm that acquiescent person, right? Or, so I think there's problems there.
So I've asked a direct question, on purpose, of course. It's a very subtle issue, and as you know, we agree on a lot of points. I've been saying, at least for 15 years, though, that Chinese make more money than the average American. They go to good schools at a far higher rate than the average American. On the face of it, it would seem that there are not great barriers to advancement, at least economically, in the U.S. Of course, that's not the whole story, and I do think that any minority in any country does face headwinds if they're not the mainstream, and there also may be specific factors to the United States that make it hard for Asians to integrate as well. I mean, we all had Chinese parents growing up in America, and America is a pretty extroverted, self-promotional, talkative culture, and I don't think China or East Asia is, and that's an interesting comparison because then how do Chinese in other countries feel in the West that are not as extroverted and out there? Maybe they integrate better. So there's many factors going on.
Yeah.
I actually had, and this was not even as a kid. This was as a working professional, back when I worked in the sea of cubicles, right? And sometimes you'd be too busy to have a full lunch, and you'd eat your lunch at your desk as you're working on a project. And I literally heated dumplings from the night before, right? And brought them to my desk. I was eating, and then my coworker was like, "What died?"
Right.
Right? And I was like, "Nothing died."
That's a little microaggression too, right?
That's a little bit, right? My lunch smelled like roadkill.
Yeah.
It's really interesting you bring up food. I've not felt that myself, but because it's my YouTube channel, I can say what I want. But when I was working at The Economist, the very first, before I was even there, I went to a strategy meeting. I met my boss, and we went to a Chinese restaurant in Hong Kong. And he said, "Frank, you're Chinese. Why don't you order the food for us?" And I was quite taken aback by that he would expect me to know the Chinese culinary tradition, which I don't. And he's a Brit, actually, and there's a bit of a cultural disconnect as well. But I think that part of wanting to belong in American society is not to get those questions like, don't assume I know these things because of the way I look, right? Or that I know Kung Fu, which I think we've all gotten.
And that's,
right?
to me, that's like otherizing, right? I know he was in Britain, you weren't in America. But if that was said to you in America, it would be like, okay, so at the end of the day, the bucket I'm put in, regardless of the fact that I was born in America or whatever, I speak English natively, at the end of the day, you're Chinese. And then over here, at the end of the day, you're not Chinese. Right. And so it's less of where your passport is and more of just the feeling that the majority of culture has, because we're such visual animals.
Right.
We visually discriminate. And I mean that not in the social sense, I mean that in the scientific sense, right? We visually discriminate very quickly.
Well, and certainly there are times when we feel that way. It's not always.
Sure.
Right? And we can't take one snapshot and say that's how people view us. But there are certainly snapshots where you're over there, and then in that moment people perceive you a certain way, and you'd rather not maybe be perceived that way, and the same thing here. But it's not all the time.
Right.
But there are those snapshots which are more common than if you were fully assimilated into a place.
Yeah. That particular incident is it's less about whiteness versus Asianness and more about nationality, because I think an American in a similar position would know that's a taboo question. I think he's just not of our culture, and he doesn't quite understand who I am, or he doesn't get all the rules that we would abide by. Right?
Yeah.
So it actually,
I don't know.
Yeah. You think that would happen in the U.S. too?
The first time I was asked why I spoke English so well was not in California where I grew up, because I think in California there's a lot, it's a more diverse culture. You have a lot of people who speak a lot of other languages. Was in D.C. on a legislative trip with the APA to our nation's capital, and from a legislative aid. So I wasn't part of a visiting Chinese delegation or anything. I was, with the APA, the American Psychological Association. So I don't know. I think that before it gets to nationality, it's this assumption when people look at you that you must not be completely here. There's something about you that is not completely here.
But that's bias, right? That's assumptions. That's a snapshot. And so, where do you draw that line? Because if you were that person, you might jump to based on your cultural upbringing, you might have that same conclusion. I would say where it crosses the line is that they start getting to know you, and that doesn't change the perception.
Well, I've certainly gotten that much more in China than America, and I've said many times I'm much more conscious of my race here than I am in America. So I do feel that, I don't experience that in America too much. But I mean, imagine this. I mean, if we want to avoid the situations, it actually drives a lot of minorities, not just Asians or Chinese, to want to integrate more and even overcompensate and be more American or white than others. So I think there are a lot of ethnic minorities in America that do that. They become more nationalistic, more patriotic, in an effort to avoid being, categorized that way.
In an effort to avoid the otherization.
I mean, that there's something about, that inside of me that pushes back on that. Because why can't we just be ourselves, right? Why do we have to try so hard? Do others have to try so hard? Right. And so I think ultimately you want to be part of a culture where you can generally be yourself, like not be an a-hole. At the same time, you don't have to pretend to be someone you're not.
Yeah. So just a few days ago, wasn't Vivek Ramaswamy interviewed by Ann Coulter?
He's a great example, isn't he?
Right. Or I think he was being interviewed by Ann Coulter or whatever.
Who is this?
Vivek Ramaswamy.
He was
a previous candidate, for president, but dropped out of the race, and he's an Indian American. And I believe he's American. I may be wrong, but I think he's American born.
Well, he has to be to
that's right to run for president. You're right. So he's an American-born person of Indian descent, East Indian descent, and he was being interviewed by Ann Coulter, a presumably Caucasian white woman. And I think they were having a conversation. At some point, she said, "Well, I would not have voted for you anyway." I think the conversation was, "I agree with you on so many points." I being Ann Coulter, not me, but I agree with you on so many points. But I would not have voted for you at the end of the day because you're an Indian. Ooh. I think the exact quote was, "You're an Indian." So there's a perfect example, I think, of at the end of the day, this person who has taken it upon herself, I suppose, I don't know, to represent something or whatever, is making, but nonetheless, whether she's taken that upon herself or not, she is part of the majority culture, and by the other person would be viewed as part of the majority culture, and saying at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, I don't care that you're born there, care what your passport says, I don't even care that I agree with you.
So she knew all that. She wasn't making a mistake.
She
But she was trying to get under Vivek's skin, I guess.
I don't know what, I would not presume to know what's in her mind or what her intentions were, but her words, that is the sort of thing that sometimes we grow up with. Right? And it has, we were talking about this outside a little bit, where I didn't feel necessarily discriminated against when I was growing up at all. Like, I don't, nothing comes to mind, in my experience as a child that is, directly discriminatory, except a couple things about food, couple ching-chang-chongs. Okay, I take that back. Okay, there was a couple of things. But I do remember that that everybody in authority was white, although most people around me, in my neighborhood and in my classes, were Asian, right? But the teachers were mostly white. The police officers and fire people were mostly white. people you interfaced in society when you, I don't know, went with your parents to the bank teller, that when you went to go buy a car, or the guy processing your home loan or whatever it is, right? We're basically, with a few exceptions, all white. And I think that's kind of sent a little bit of a message, you know, that like, I don't know, it's one of those things that kind of sticks with you and can affect you growing up. I think, luckily, we, myself included, come from a place of privilege where we have other tools to fight against that, right? And we have the privilege of growing up in the States, whereas our parents didn't, right? And they came to the States as like, you know, English ESL minorities. You know?
Well, if you just look at a numbers game, and especially, you know, however many years ago, what percentage of the population was actually Asian? And so when you are part of a group that is not the majority, then you are going to get exposed to this, you know, this other majority group. Same thing in China. If you are coming here as a Westerner and you're coming here, then everyone around you in positions of power is going to be. So in that respect, there's nothing sort of, I don't know, especially sinister about that. And at the same time, it does shape you because you've grown up as second generation or first generation. So what you're exposed to at home in your immediate environment maybe is one way, and then the broader world. So there is a bit of, again, that clash a little bit.
I'm curious about what the impact of colonial history has been on this experience on both sides of the Pacific, right? Here in China, having a certain relationship with colonialism that may be different from in the States, right? At least the majority culture experiences in the States. I wonder what impact that has on our experience, you know, in that colonial mentality. Because I have definitely, when I first came to China in a previous era, you know, I first came to China in 2008. And there definitely was this kind of feeling that if you came from the West, and especially if you were a white person coming from the West, you possessed an air of authority, an air of you know what you're talking about. And that you feel that to a certain extent even now. Like I've been in a lot of meetings and a lot of media related interactions where you sort of had to have the white guy to lend legitimacy to what you were, or to lend what they called an international perspective to, you know, to whatever was happening. Right, I remember I was participating in a media panel once, and you know, they were like, oh, we need an American perspective, and I said, I'm an American.
Right.
And they said, oh yeah, but you know what I mean, right? And I think I was like, yeah, I think I do know what you mean, right?
That was a Chinese person saying that, though, right?
That was a Chinese person saying.
Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, I just wonder how much of this has its roots in a colonial history. Yeah.
I think it's unavoidable. I mean, the West did rule the world for a very long time, so I think
in a colonial way.
But I mean, and it has been richer for a long time. So whiteness does connote power for much of the world, whether or not we want that to be the case or not, right?
Yeah.
So I want to wrap things up and go back to the point you made earlier about when Ann Coulter called Vivek Indian, okay, which is overstepping the bounds, and
she even said an Indian. So that's interesting.
An Indian, right? So she was, you know, provocative and transgressive on purpose. I'll bring up another example, and I will bring this back to Chinese Americans. So I remember years ago, I was listening to NPR, America's National Public Radio, and a show called Car Talk, which you might, it's a car show. It's about repairing cars, right? Sure. And so somebody called with a very thick Russian accent, asking about how to repair his car, and the hosts are like, oh, hey, where you from? And he took great offense. He was like, why do you assume I'm not American? And I like that anecdote because I think it says something about like our expectations of as Americans to belong as Chinese Americans or other kinds of Americans. But also that automatic sanction that we often have of people who do break these taboos. Like you're not supposed to ask me where I'm from if I don't have an accent. Even if I do, maybe you shouldn't, right? And if you do that, I take offense, and we enforce those norms. The bigger point I want to make is that cross-nationally, you see that the data shows that Chinese Americans have a greater sense of American identity than, say, Chinese Canadians do of Canada or Chinese Brits do of Britain. And there's something about American culture that enforces that that does assimilate over this 250-year history, but also I think contributes to the American national project and its overall strength and sense of identity. Even though we seem we're fragmenting, over the long history, it's been a great strength. And so I kind of want to get your thoughts on that. But, I realize that being in China, because this country is all about, making sure we're all citizens and we're all Chinese. But America's done something similar, and I think we're in the middle of that.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder. I would love to see the data on. I think what you're getting at is perceived assimilation of Chinese folks in America versus Chinese folks in other countries.
Well, self-perception. How do you feel American, Canadian, British?
Yeah. So it's a subjective experience right. So it's your own perceived assimilation into the majority culture. But I wonder whether the differences, if they do exist there, have to do with very different immigration histories. Right.
Yeah.
And I think I can't say that I know exactly the history of Chinese immigration to France or the UK or whatnot, but I do know that history has we have had, as specifically as Chinese Americans, have had a little bit of a longer history into the United States, and I wonder whether that has affected it somehow.
Yeah.
I think the notion of America just being a melting pot. It didn't start we don't perceive it as starting off with a very, very specific type of ethnicity, although it was British people going to the U.S. And I think over time it's grown to accept people, and I think that's part of the project, right? The identity. And so, what I've noticed is that in the U.S., it's really one of the sort of the signs of credibility is how genuine of an American accent you have. It's almost in some way you can visually look like anyone, but if you have a perfect American accent,
that's the metric.
That's sort of the metric of are you really American, right? Yeah.
But what's the perfect American accent? Is it a Boston one, a Texas?
And that's something that's hard to kind of define, but when you hear it,
Yeah.
As opposed to car talk.
Great. On that end, I thank you guys for coming for this great conversation, and I hope it's valuable to you and also our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be on.